The coffee cup shattered against marble, sending espresso across the Persian rug, worth more than most people's cars. Layla al-Rashid didn't flinch as the liquid splashed her uniform, though every board member in the glass-walled conference room had gone dead silent. "You want to fire me over a customer complaint?" She pulled out her grandmother's leather-bound poetry book, its gold Arabic lettering catching the fluorescent lights. Marcus Chen claimed I was rude when I corrected his broken Arabic. He said I was just some refugee who should know her place. The CEO's face had drained of color, because Marcus Chen, their biggest client, didn't know that the refugee waitress he'd publicly humiliated was Layla al-Rashid, granddaughter of Ambassador Amira al-Rashid, owner of 43% of Chen Industries' parent company, and she'd been waiting 3 years for this moment. The Meridian restaurant buzzed with the kind of energy that only existed in Manhattan's financial district during lunch hour. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables where deals worth millions were sealed over truffle risotto and aged wine. Layla al-Rashid moved between the tables with practiced grace, her server's uniform pressed to perfection, a small notepad tucked discreetly in her apron. She had been working here for 6 months, long enough to recognize the patterns of power that flowed through these dining rooms like an invisible current. The executives who commanded respect with a glance, the assistants who scurried behind them, the subtle hierarchies that determined who got the corner booth and who waited by the bar. If you were watching this unfold from your office break room or commuting home, you'd probably recognize the dynamics immediately, the way money and status created their own gravitational pull in spaces like this. Marcus Chen entered the restaurant like he owned it, which in a way, he almost did. His company, Chen Industries, had been one of Meridian's biggest corporate accounts for the past 3 years, hosting client dinners that regularly exceeded 5 figures. He was a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled black hair and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Behind him trailed 2 younger associates, both clearly nervous about whatever business they were about to discuss. Layla watched from behind the host station as the maitre d' practically bowed while escorting them to the best table in the house, a corner booth with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Madison Avenue. The afternoon sun streaming through the glass created dramatic shadows across the white tablecloth, and Layla found herself thinking about the photography lessons her grandmother had given her years ago. How light could reveal or conceal depending on the angle. When the sommelier approached their table with the wine list, Marcus waved him away with barely a glance. "We'll start with your house Arabic coffee," he announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Make it strong, kawa kawiya." The pronunciation was so mangled that Layla winced from across the room. She had been assigned to their table, a detail that felt like more than coincidence given the conversation she'd overheard about Middle Eastern business partnerships. As she approached with water glasses and menus, she caught fragments of their discussion, something about construction contracts in Dubai and the importance of cultural sensitivity in international business. The irony wasn't lost on her, especially when Marcus continued to butcher Arabic phrases, clearly trying to impress his associates with his supposed worldliness. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Layla said, setting down the glasses with the kind of professional smile she'd perfected over months of service industry work. "I understand you'd like to start with Arabic coffee. Would you prefer it prepared traditionally, or would you like to see our espresso menu?" Marcus looked up at her with the kind of dismissive glance she'd become accustomed to, the look that sized up her uniform, her accent, her place in the hierarchy, and found it wanting. "Just bring us the kahwa," he said, again massacring the pronunciation so badly that it sounded more like kava. His associates shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing something was off, but not quite sure what. Layla felt the familiar weight of her grandmother's poetry book in her bag behind the bar, its leather cover worn smooth from decades of handling, and drew strength from the memory of the lessons it contained. "Of course, sir. And just to clarify, you'd like it prepared with cardamom and served in traditional cups, or—" Layla began, but Marcus cut her off with an impatient gesture. "Look, just bring us the Arabic coffee. Kahwa sagira, understand?" This time his pronunciation was so far off that he'd essentially ordered small garbage instead of coffee. and Layla felt her professional composure wavering. She had spent 4 years studying international business at Columbia, had grown up speaking Arabic as fluently as English, and had been raised by a grandmother who could recite Mahmoud Darwish from memory. The disrespect wasn't just personal, it was cultural, linguistic, and completely unnecessary. "I believe you mean Kawa Sagira," she said gently, offering the correct pronunciation with the same patience she might use with a child learning their first words. "And yes, I understand perfectly." The change in Marcus's demeanor was immediate and volcanic. His face flushed red as his associates exchanged alarmed glances, clearly recognizing that their lunch meeting was about to become something else entirely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rising to a level that caused conversations at nearby tables to pause. "Did you just correct me? Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Layla maintained her professional stance, but something in her eyes shifted, a spark of steel that hadn't been there moments before. "I apologize if I overstepped, sir. I simply wanted to make sure we prepared your order correctly." But Marcus was beyond de-escalation now, his ego bruised by being corrected in front of his business associates by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "You're a waitress," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. "Your job is to take orders, not give language lessons. I don't need some refugee who barely speaks English telling me how to pronounce Arabic." The restaurant had gone completely silent now, 50 conversations stopping mid-sentence as every eye turned toward their corner booth. Layla felt the weight of all those stares, the familiar burn of being reduced to a stereotype, of having her intelligence and dignity dismissed because of assumptions about who she was and where she came from. But instead of the shame or anger that Marcus clearly expected, she felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating clarity that reminded her exactly why she'd been working in restaurants for the past 6 months. Why she'd been documenting every conversation, every client dinner, every carelessly spoken word about international business deals. "I'll get your coffee right away, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady as granite. "And I'll remember this conversation." The promise in those words was subtle enough that Marcus missed it entirely, too caught up in his own performance of power to notice the shift in the air around him. As Layla walked away from the table, she felt the eyes of every staff member following her movement. Some sympathetic, others nervous about what Marcus might do to their jobs if this incident escalated. The manager, David, was already approaching from behind the bar, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation, clearly weighing the cost of losing a major corporate account against defending his employee. But Layla had already made her own calculations, had been making them for months as she gathered intelligence on the very man who had just publicly humiliated her. She touched the small recording device in her apron pocket, a habit she'd developed during her months of careful documentation, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Marcus Chen had no idea what he'd just set in motion. No clue that the refugee waitress he'd just dismissed was about to become the most dangerous person in his carefully constructed world. The game had officially begun, and she'd been preparing for this moment far longer than he could possibly imagine. David Miller had been managing upscale restaurants for 15 years, long enough to recognize when a situation was about to explode beyond his control. He watched Marcus Chen's table from behind the mahogany bar, noting the way other diners kept glancing over, the subtle tension that had settled over the entire dining room like a storm cloud. The man was still gesturing aggressively while his associates looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly wishing they could disappear into the leather upholstery. David had dealt with difficult customers before, but Chen was different. He represented nearly $200,000 in annual revenue between his personal dining and corporate events. The math was simple and brutal. One waitress versus a quarter of his yearly budget. As he watched Layla return to the kitchen with the composure of someone who'd just been asked about the weather rather than publicly degraded, he felt the familiar weight of compromise settling on his shoulders. The kitchen buzzed with nervous energy as news of the confrontation spread through the staff. Maria, the head chef, looked up from her prep station with concern etched across her face, while the other servers clustered near the coffee machine, their voices low and urgent. "What happened out there?" asked Jamie, a server who'd been working alongside Layla for the past few months. Chen looked like he was about to blow a gasket. Layla moved through their questions with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else, preparing the Arabic coffee with practiced precision. She measured the cardamom with steady hands, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the current crisis. These people had become something like family over the past 6 months, but they couldn't know the full truth of why she was here, couldn't understand that this confrontation was both catastrophic and exactly what she'd been working toward. "He's demanding to speak to the manager," she told them simply, adding just enough detail to satisfy their curiosity without revealing the depth of her planning. "Something about customer service standards." The lie came easily, a skill she'd developed during her months of careful investigation. Jamie shook his head in disgust, having witnessed enough similar incidents to recognize the pattern. "Let me guess. Another corporate asshole who thinks his money means he can treat us like servants." The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Layla, who knew exactly how much money Marcus Chen had and where it came from. She'd spent weeks analyzing his company's financial reports, understanding the web of international contracts and partnerships that funded his lifestyle. The Arabic coffee finished brewing, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, and she poured it into traditional small cups with the kind of reverence her grandmother had taught her years ago. The staff meeting that followed was exactly what Layla had expected. David's apologies mixing with thinly veiled warnings about the importance of customer satisfaction. "I understand that Mr. Chen may have been inappropriate," he said, choosing his words with the care of someone walking through a minefield. "But we have to consider the bigger picture here. His company represents a significant portion of our business." Layla listened to the familiar speech about professionalism and customer service, noting which of her colleagues avoided eye contact and which ones looked genuinely angry on her behalf. She'd documented similar conversations at 3 other restaurants over the past year, watching how economic pressure consistently trumped human dignity in establishments that depended on corporate accounts. The pattern was so predictable it might have been scripted, except this time she was the one holding the pen. When David asked to speak with her privately in his office, Layla followed him with the resignation of someone who'd played this scene before. The office was cramped and cluttered, dominated by a desk covered in invoices and vendor catalogs, the walls lined with wine certificates and photographs of successful events. "Look, Layla," David began, his tone attempting to strike a balance between authority and sympathy. "You're a good employee, one of the best we've had. But Chen is threatening to pull his account if we don't address the situation." She sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, the picture of professional composure even as she calculated the precise words needed to maintain her position. "I understand, Mr. Miller. What exactly is Mr. Chen requesting?" The question was perfectly innocent, but David heard the steel underneath it, the suggestion that she might not be as powerless as he assumed. The conversation that followed was a delicate dance of threats and counter-threats, David trying to find a solution that would satisfy Chen without admitting fault, Layla pushing back just enough to seem like a normal employee defending her dignity. She knew exactly how far she could push before he'd have no choice but to fire her, and she rode that line with the precision of a tightrope walker. "I think perhaps a written apology would be appropriate," she suggested, knowing that Chen would never accept such a minor concession. Something that acknowledges the misunderstanding without admitting wrongdoing. David seized on the compromise with visible relief, already mentally drafting the letter that would restore his most valuable customer's goodwill. What he couldn't see was the recording device in Layla's pocket, still running, capturing every word of their negotiation for the legal files she'd been building for months. That evening, Layla sat in her small apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by the artifacts of a double life that would have shocked her former colleagues at the restaurant. The walls were covered with financial documents, corporate organizational charts, and photographs that told a very different story than her server's uniform suggested. At the center of it all sat her grandmother's leather-bound poetry book, its pages filled with handwritten verses in flowing Arabic script and margin notes in 3 different languages. The book had been Ambassador Amira al-Rashid's companion through decades of diplomatic service, and now it served as Layla's anchor in a mission that stretched back 3 generations. She opened it to a particular page, a poem about patience and justice that her grandmother had marked with a small star, and felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through months of careful planning. Her phone buzzed with a text from her contact at the State Department, a former colleague of her grandmother's who'd been tracking Chen Industries' Middle Eastern contracts for the better part of 2 years. "Heard there was an incident today," the message read. "Everything proceeding according to plan?" Layla smiled as she typed back a confirmation, adding details about the recording she'd made and David's predictable response. The incident at the restaurant was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a carefully orchestrated revelation that would expose not just Marcus Chen's casual prejudice, but the systemic corruption that had funded it. She'd been building this case methodically, using her position in the service industry to gather evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional channels. The poetry book lay open beside her laptop, its gold lettering catching the light from her desk lamp, a reminder that some fights were worth waiting for, worth planning for, worth seeing through to the very end. The Columbia University Library at midnight held a special kind of silence, the kind that seemed to amplify the sound of turning pages and clicking keyboards. Layla had claimed a corner table on the 7th floor, surrounded by financial reports, legal documents, and her laptop screen glowing with spreadsheets that would have made forensic accountants weep with joy. She'd been coming here 3 nights a week for the past 8 months, using her alumni access to dig through databases that most people didn't even know existed. The poetry book sat open beside her stack of documents, its familiar presence grounding her as she navigated through the labyrinthine world of international business contracts and shell companies. Most people saw her as a graduate student pulling late-night research sessions, which wasn't entirely wrong, just incomplete in ways that would have shocked her former professors. The Chen Industries files spread across her table told a story of systematic exploitation that stretched from Manhattan boardrooms to construction sites in Qatar and Dubai. Marcus Chen's company had built its fortune on Middle Eastern infrastructure projects, securing contracts through a combination of cultural posturing and strategic partnerships that looked legitimate on paper but fell apart under scrutiny. Layla traced the money through a dozen subsidiary companies, noting how profits flowed back to New York, while workers in the Gulf remained underpaid and overworked. Her grandmother had been part of the diplomatic team that originally negotiated some of these partnerships back in the 1990s, when the promise of cultural exchange and mutual benefit had seemed genuine. The irony that Marcus now used butchered Arabic phrases to seal deals worth millions wasn't lost on her. It was the entire point. Each document she photographed with her phone told part of a larger story about how American companies leveraged cultural connections for profit, while showing open contempt for the cultures they claimed to understand. The pattern was so consistent, it might have been a business model: hire consultants with Middle Eastern backgrounds for legitimacy, then treat them as expendable once the contracts were signed. Layla had identified at least 6 former employees of Chen Industries who'd left under suspicious circumstances, all of them immigrants or first-generation Americans who'd initially been praised for their cultural expertise. Their severance agreements included unusually restrictive non-disclosure clauses, the kind of legal language that suggested Chen had something significant to hide. She made careful notes about each case, cross-referencing termination dates with major contract signings and finding correlations that would make any employment lawyer salivate. The breakthrough came at 2:15 in the morning, buried in a subsidiary filing that most people would have glossed over as routine paperwork. Chen Industries had been claiming tax benefits for cultural education and diversity initiatives that existed only on paper, using fake consulting fees to Middle Eastern organizations that turned out to be nothing more than post office boxes in Delaware. The fraud was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Not just tax evasion, but active misrepresentation of cultural partnerships for financial gain. Layla felt her pulse quicken as she traced the money through 3 different shell companies, each one designed to obscure the true destination of funds that were supposed to be promoting international understanding. Her grandmother would have recognized this pattern, would have seen how legitimate diplomatic work was being perverted for profit. The security guard making his rounds paused at her table, noting the late hour with the kind of concern that suggested genuine care rather than suspicion. "Long night?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low out of respect for the library's atmosphere. Layla looked up from her laptop, realizing she'd been so absorbed in the financial documents that hours had passed without her notice. "Research project," she said simply, which was true enough in its way. "Trying to understand how international business really works." The guard nodded with understanding, probably assuming she was another graduate student struggling with a dissertation deadline. If he'd looked more closely at her screen, he might have noticed that her research included wire transfer records and SEC filings that told a very different story than any academic paper. By 3 in the morning, Layla had assembled enough evidence to destroy Chen Industries 3 times over. But destruction wasn't her goal. Justice was. And justice required more than just financial documents. She needed to understand the human cost of Marcus's business practices, needed to document the impact on real people whose lives had been affected by his company's operations. Her phone contained contact information for dozens of former employees, construction workers, and business partners who'd been burned by Chen's methods. Most of them would never speak openly about their experiences, too afraid of legal retaliation or immigration consequences. But some might be willing to share their stories if approached by someone who understood their cultural background, someone who could speak their language both literally and figuratively. The poetry book seemed to glow in the harsh fluorescent light as Layla closed her laptop and gathered her documents. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the margins of one particular poem about patience and perseverance, advice written in 3 languages for a granddaughter she'd known would need it someday. Ambassador Amira al-Rashid had spent her career building bridges between cultures, working to create understanding and cooperation in an increasingly fractured world. She'd believed in the power of diplomacy, in the possibility that people from different backgrounds could work together toward common goals. Marcus Chen had taken that legacy and perverted it, using cultural connections for profit while showing open contempt for the very people he claimed to understand. The insult at the restaurant had been personal, but the broader pattern was something far worse, a systematic abuse of trust that demanded a response proportional to its scope. As Layla walked through the empty campus toward the subway station, she felt the weight of months of preparation settling into clarity. The incident at Meridian had been the catalyst she'd been waiting for, the moment when Marcus's prejudice would finally be exposed in a way that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. She had the financial evidence, the legal documentation, and now the recorded proof of his character. But more than that, she had something Marcus could never understand: the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike, the cultural knowledge to understand what his words really meant, and the family connections to make sure her voice would be heard when the time came to speak. The train carried her through the dark tunnels beneath Manhattan, past the financial district where Marcus slept in his luxury apartment, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. The cafe on East 74th Street looked unremarkable from the outside. Just another Upper East Side establishment serving overpriced lattes to professionals who could afford them. But inside, Layla recognized the subtle signs of a place where serious conversations happened away from prying eyes. The tables were spaced far enough apart to prevent eavesdropping. The lighting was warm enough to feel intimate but bright enough to read documents, and the background music was carefully calibrated to mask sensitive discussions. She'd chosen this location specifically because it was the kind of place where former diplomats and international business consultants gathered to share information that would never appear in official reports. Her grandmother had brought her here as a teenager, teaching her to recognize the networks of influence that operated parallel to official channels. Amara Kasim arrived precisely on time, her silver hair swept back in a chignon that spoke of decades spent in boardrooms and embassy dining halls. She'd been Ambassador al-Rashid's deputy chief of staff for 12 years, specializing in Middle Eastern trade relations, and her retirement had done nothing to diminish the intensity of her gaze or the precision of her handshake. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said simply, settling into the chair across from Layla with the kind of presence that made waiters automatically provide better service. "Though she'd probably tell you to be more careful about the risks you're taking." The comment carried weight that went beyond concern for personal safety. In diplomatic circles, taking on someone like Marcus Chen meant potentially exposing yourself to legal retaliation that could destroy careers and reputations. Over Turkish coffee and baklava that reminded Layla of her childhood, Amara laid out the broader context that made Marcus Chen more than just another prejudiced businessman. His company's Middle Eastern contracts were part of a larger pattern of American firms exploiting cultural connections for profit while contributing to anti-Arab sentiment at home. "He's not working in isolation," Amara explained, keeping her voice low despite the cafe's discreet atmosphere. "There's a whole network of companies using similar strategies, hire cultural consultants for legitimacy, then discard them once the contracts are signed. It's systematic, and it's gotten worse since 9/11. The numbers she cited were staggering. Hundreds of millions in contracts secured through cultural posturing, thousands of workers exploited in the name of international cooperation, and a pattern of discrimination that had become so normalized it barely registered as newsworthy. The documentation that Amara provided filled 2 manila envelopes, each one containing evidence that would have taken Layla months to gather on her own. Financial records showing suspicious money transfers, correspondence between Chen Industries and their Middle Eastern partners that revealed the true nature of their relationship, and most damning of all, recorded phone calls where Marcus and his associates made jokes about the cultural sensitivity training they were required to complete for certain contracts. "We've been building this case for 2 years, Amara admitted, her expression grim with the weight of accumulated evidence. "But we needed someone on the inside. Someone who could document his behavior in a way that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or professional jealousy. Your restaurant work provided exactly the kind of evidence we needed." The revelation that her months of service industry research had been part of a larger investigation should have been shocking, but instead Layla felt a sense of completion, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. Her grandmother's connections had been working behind the scenes to expose Marcus Chen's operations long before the incident at Meridian, and Layla's role had been to provide the human element that would make the financial crimes feel personal and immediate. "He doesn't know, does he?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About my family connections, about who I really am?" Amara's smile was sharp as a diplomatic blade, the kind of expression that had probably ended more than one international negotiation in her favor. Marcus Chen sees what he expects to see: a young woman in service industry uniform, someone he can dismiss without consequence. It's exactly the kind of blind spot that makes men like him vulnerable. The strategy session that followed felt like something out of a spy novel, except the stakes were measured in legal precedents and public opinion rather than state secrets. Amara outlined the network of attorneys, journalists, and advocacy organizations that were already positioned to act once Layla provided the final pieces of evidence they needed. The incident at Meridian would be the spark, but the fire had been carefully prepared over months of investigation and documentation. "Timing is everything," Amara emphasized, spreading documents across the cafe table like a general planning a campaign. "We hit him from multiple directions simultaneously: legal action for the financial crimes, employment discrimination lawsuits from former employees, and media coverage that ties it all together into a larger story about corporate exploitation of cultural diversity." The weight of what she was about to unleash settled on Layla's shoulders like a cloak she'd been preparing to wear for months. This wasn't just about personal dignity or even professional revenge. It was about using Marcus Chen's prejudice to expose a system that had been operating in plain sight for years. Her grandmother's poetry book seemed to pulse with significance as Amara explained the final phases of their plan, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling during moments that required both courage and patience. Ambassador al-Rashid had spent her career fighting for cultural understanding through official channels, working within the system to build bridges and create opportunities for cooperation. Now her granddaughter would honor that legacy by exposing those who perverted it for profit. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Amara handed Layla a phone number written on embassy stationery, a direct line to someone at the Department of Justice who specialized in international business fraud. "When you're ready to move forward," she said, "call this number first. They've been waiting for exactly this kind of case, something with clear documentation and a human story that will resonate with juries. The implication was clear. Layla's confrontation with Marcus Chen would be the opening move in a legal chess game that had been planned for months. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her grandmother's poetry book, between pages that contained verses about justice and patience, written in 3 languages for moments exactly like this one. The subway ride back to Brooklyn gave Layla time to process the magnitude of what she'd learned and what she was about to do. Marcus Chen had no idea that the refugee waitress he'd humiliated was connected to a network of former diplomats, Justice Department attorneys, and advocacy organizations that had been documenting his company's operations for years. His prejudice hadn't just been personally insulting, it had been strategically perfect, providing exactly the kind of documented evidence they needed to transform a financial crimes case into a story about human dignity and cultural respect. The train carried her through tunnels that connected Manhattan's financial district to the diverse neighborhoods of Brooklyn, past communities that represented the kind of cultural richness that Marcus claimed to understand but had never bothered to actually respect. Tomorrow, she would return to Meridian Restaurant and continue playing her role as a simple server. But now she knew that role was temporary, that the real performance was just beginning. The first sign that Marcus Chen was escalating his campaign came through David Miller's nervous phone call at 6:30 in the morning. Layla answered on the second ring, already knowing what she'd hear in his voice. The particular strain that came from watching your livelihood threatened by forces beyond your control. "I'm sorry, Layla," he began without preamble, the words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing them since dawn. "Chen called our corporate office last night. He's threatening to pull all his accounts unless we terminate your employment immediately." The ultimatum was exactly what she'd expected, perfectly timed and delivered with the kind of pressure that had probably worked dozens of times before. Marcus understood how to leverage economic power, how to make individual dignity seem like an unaffordable luxury in an industry that operated on razor-thin margins. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in professional helplessness. David explaining corporate policies and legal requirements, while clearly wishing he could find another solution. Layla listened with the sympathy of someone who understood exactly how impossible his position had become, even as she calculated the precise timing of her next moves. "I understand completely, Mr. Miller," she said, letting just enough disappointment creep into her voice to sound authentic. "When would you like me to clean out my locker?" The question seemed to relieve some of his tension. Dealing with an employee who accepted termination gracefully was so much easier than managing someone who might threaten legal action or cause a scene that could affect other customers. Within 48 hours, Marcus's influence had spread through Manhattan's restaurant industry like a virus targeting her specifically. The call from Bistro Lawrence came first, the manager awkwardly explaining that they'd decided to go in a different direction for their server position. Then Café Rouge, where she'd been scheduled for a trial shift, suddenly discovered they were overstaffed for the season. Each rejection was delivered with the kind of vague politeness that suggested legal consultation. Careful wording designed to avoid any appearance of coordination or conspiracy. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who understood how the city's high-end hospitality industry operated. A tight network where reputation and relationships mattered more than talent or experience. By the end of the week, Layla had been effectively blacklisted from every upscale restaurant that catered to corporate accounts, her name somehow circulating through management circles with warnings about difficult employees and customer service issues. The speed and efficiency of the campaign was almost impressive, demonstrating exactly the kind of systematic approach to problem-solving that had made Marcus successful in international business. He'd identified a threat to his reputation and moved to neutralize it using the same strategic thinking he applied to construction contracts and trade negotiations. What he couldn't see was that each rejection call she received was being carefully documented, each conversation recorded and transcribed for the legal files that would soon reshape his understanding of consequences. The emotional toll of systematic rejection began to wear on her resolve in ways that Layla hadn't entirely anticipated. She'd prepared for Marcus to retaliate, had even counted on it as part of her larger strategy. But experiencing the reality of professional ostracism was different from planning for it. Each failed interview chipped away at her confidence. Each polite rejection letter reminded her of how precarious economic survival could be for people without family connections or financial safety nets. Sitting in her Brooklyn apartment surrounded by employment rejection emails, she felt the weight of representing not just herself, but everyone who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced because they lacked the power to fight back. The poetry book lay open on her coffee table, its pages offering comfort in 3 languages for moments when justice felt more like a luxury than a right. Her family's reaction to the employment setbacks revealed the generational differences in how they understood power and resistance. Her parents, both successful professionals who'd built their careers through careful networking and strategic compromise, urged her to consider a more diplomatic approach to resolving the conflict with Marcus. Perhaps a private conversation, her mother suggested during one of their weekly phone calls, something that allows him to save face while acknowledging the misunderstanding. The advice came from love and experience, from people who understood how easily careers could be destroyed by powerful enemies. But it also came from a different generation's understanding of how change happened, one that prioritized stability over confrontation and incremental progress over dramatic revelation. The lowest point came during a particularly brutal rejection interview at La Bernardin, where the hiring manager's dismissive attitude made it clear that Marcus's version of events had preceded her arrival. "We're looking for team players," the woman explained with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "People who understand that customer satisfaction is our highest priority." The implication was unmistakable. Layla had been branded as someone who put personal pride above professional duty, someone whose cultural sensitivities made her unsuitable for high-end service work. Walking through Midtown after the meeting, surrounded by the lunch crowd of professionals who took their economic security for granted, she felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, of having her intelligence and dignity dismissed because of assumptions about who she was and what she deserved. But as she sat on a bench in Bryant Park, watching office workers hurry past with their takeout orders and urgent phone calls, Layla realized that Marcus's campaign against her was actually providing something invaluable: documentation of exactly how systematic discrimination operated in practice. Each rejection, each coordinated response, each carefully worded explanation added another layer to the legal case that Amara and her network had been building for months. Marcus thought he was silencing a troublesome employee, but he was actually creating evidence of conspiracy and retaliation that would be impossible to dismiss in court. The poetry book in her bag seemed to pulse with significance as she understood that her grandmother's lessons about patience and strategy were finally bearing fruit. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was to let your enemies reveal themselves completely before striking back. The phone call that evening from her contact at the Justice Department confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. Marcus's retaliation campaign had crossed several legal lines, creating exactly the kind of documented pattern that prosecutors needed to build conspiracy charges alongside the financial crimes. "Keep documenting everything," the attorney advised, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose case had just gotten significantly stronger. "His efforts to silence you are actually giving us leverage we wouldn't have had otherwise." As Layla hung up the phone and opened her grandmother's poetry book to a passage about the patience required for true justice, she felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through months of careful planning. Marcus Chen had no idea that every move he made against her was being carefully catalogued by people who understood power better than he ever would. The game was far from over, and she was finally ready to play her real hand. The law offices of Richardson, Webb & Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a crystal needle, its conference rooms offering panoramic views of Central Park and the financial district beyond. Layla sat at the end of a mahogany table that could seat 20, her grandmother's poetry book resting beside a stack of legal documents thick enough to serve as a doorstop. Across from her, Marcus Chen looked smaller than she remembered, his usual swagger diminished by the presence of 3 attorneys and a court reporter whose fingers moved across her stenotype with mechanical precision. He'd arrived expecting a settlement negotiation, possibly a non-disclosure agreement that would make the whole embarrassing incident disappear with a stroke of a check. Instead, He found himself facing a woman he'd dismissed as powerless, surrounded by evidence of crimes he'd assumed would never see daylight. "Mr. Chen," began Catherine Richardson, the senior partner whose reputation for corporate fraud cases made Fortune 500 executives wake up in cold sweats, "I think there's been some confusion about why we're here today." She gestured toward the documents spread across the table. Financial records, employment contracts, recorded conversations, and photographs that told a story of systematic exploitation stretching back 5 years. "This isn't about a customer service complaint or hurt feelings. This is about your company's pattern of discriminatory practices and financial fraud in connection with Middle Eastern business contracts." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each legal term precisely chosen for maximum impact. Layla watched his face cycle through confusion, denial, and the first flickering signs of genuine fear as the scope of what he was facing began to register. The revelation of Layla's true identity came in stages, each disclosure carefully timed to maximize psychological impact. "You might be wondering," Catherine continued, "how a waitress came to possess detailed financial records from your company's international operations. I'd like you to meet Layla al-Rashid, granddaughter of Ambassador Amira al-Rashid, who helped negotiate the original framework agreements that your company has been systematically violating for profit." Marcus's face went through a transformation that Layla found almost artistic in its completeness. The arrogant dismissal replaced by shock, then calculating reassessment, then something approaching panic as he began to understand the depth of his miscalculation. The woman he'd publicly humiliated for being just some refugee was connected to the very diplomatic networks that had created his business opportunities in the first place. The financial documents told a story of breathtaking audacity, even by the standards of international corporate fraud. Marcus had been claiming tax benefits for cultural education programs that existed only on paper, using fake consulting fees to launder money through Middle Eastern shell companies, and systematically underpaying workers while inflating costs to maximize profit margins. Each transaction had been carefully hidden behind layers of legal complexity, but Layla's months of investigation had unraveled the scheme with the kind of methodical precision that her grandmother had brought to diplomatic negotiations. "The beauty of your operation," Layla said, speaking directly to Marcus for the first time since entering the conference room, "was how you used cultural consulting as cover for financial crimes. Very clever, until you decided to publicly humiliate someone who actually understood both the culture and the consulting business." The recorded conversation from Meridian Restaurant played through speakers that made every word crystal clear, Marcus's voice dripping with contempt as he dismissed Layla as just some refugee who should know her place. But now they had additional recordings, phone calls between Marcus and his associates making jokes about diversity theater and cultural window dressing, conversations about how to exploit cultural partnerships while showing minimal respect for their partners. The contrast between his public statements about international cooperation and his private mockery of cultural sensitivity was so stark it might have been comedy if the human cost hadn't been so real. Layla felt a surge of satisfaction watching Marcus listen to his own words played back in a context where they couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "The employment discrimination case writes itself," Catherine explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd been handed a perfect case. 6 former employees with similar backgrounds, all terminated after securing major contracts, all bound by unusually restrictive non-disclosure agreements. But that's just the beginning. She gestured toward another stack of documents that detailed the human cost of Marcus's business practices. Construction workers in Dubai, whose wages had been diverted through shell companies. Cultural consultants whose expertise had been exploited, then discarded. Community organizations whose trust had been violated for profit. The pattern was so systematic, it suggested not just individual greed, but institutional corruption that reached beyond Chen Industries into the broader world of international business consulting. The moment when Marcus finally understood the scope of what he was facing arrived with an almost audible click, like a safe door closing on his previous life. His attorneys huddled around him, their urgent whispers suggesting damage control strategies that might have worked if they'd been implemented months earlier. But Layla and her team had been too thorough, too patient, too willing to let Marcus reveal the full extent of his operations before moving against him. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The restaurant job, the confrontation, all of it." The accusation carried a note of admiration alongside the anger, recognition of strategic thinking that matched his own approach to business. Layla nodded with the kind of calm satisfaction that came from seeing months of careful planning reach fruition. "I plan to document your business practices," she corrected, her voice carrying echoes of diplomatic training that went back generations. "Your decision to publicly humiliate me was entirely your own choice, driven by prejudices that made you vulnerable to exactly this kind of exposure." The poetry book seemed to glow in the conference room's harsh lighting as she explained how her grandmother's connections had provided access to government files, how her own academic background had enabled her to trace financial transactions across multiple jurisdictions, and how Marcus's own behavior had provided the personal element needed to transform a white-collar crime case into a story about human dignity and cultural respect. The investigation had been systematic and professional, but his downfall had been entirely self-inflicted. The terms of the settlement that Catherine outlined were designed not just to punish Marcus, but to reshape how his industry operated going forward. Restitution to workers who'd been exploited, funding for cultural education programs that actually existed, and most importantly, cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar schemes at other companies. "This case becomes the template," Catherine explained, her tone suggesting long-term strategic thinking that extended far beyond individual punishment. "Your cooperation helps us expose a systemic problem, or your resistance makes you the poster child for exactly the kind of corporate exploitation that needs to be eliminated." The choice was presented with diplomatic precision, offering Marcus a path toward reduced consequences if he was willing to help dismantle the network he'd been part of. As the meeting concluded and Marcus's attorneys began the process of damage control that would consume the next several months of their professional lives, Layla felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling into clarity. Ambassador al-Rashid had spent her career building bridges between cultures, creating frameworks for cooperation and understanding that men like Marcus had perverted for profit. Now, her granddaughter had used those same diplomatic skills to expose the perversion, honoring the original vision while protecting it from those who would exploit it. The poetry book that had guided her through months of investigation would return to its place of honor in her apartment, its pages filled with wisdom about patience and justice that had proven more valuable than any business degree or legal training. The game was over, but the real work of building a more just system was just beginning. The Chen Industries boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that spoke of power exercised from comfortable distance. The mahogany conference table reflected the morning light streaming through glass, creating patterns that shifted like the balance of power in the room itself. Layla entered wearing a charcoal suit that transformed her from service worker to corporate professional, her grandmother's poetry book tucked discreetly in her briefcase alongside documents that would reshape everyone's understanding of the company they thought they knew. The board members, 12 executives who'd built their careers on carefully managed risk, sat in leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed panic. Marcus Chen had called the emergency board meeting himself, a desperate attempt to control the narrative before it spiraled completely beyond his management. He sat at the head of the table looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the past week, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone discovering that consequences could finally reach him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. There have been allegations regarding our international business practices, and I wanted to address them directly before they become public." The understatement was so profound it might have been comedy, except everyone in the room could feel the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. When Catherine Richardson entered with her team of attorneys, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. She moved with the kind of predatory grace that suggested decades of corporate warfare, her presence immediately shifting the balance of power away from Marcus and toward something larger and more dangerous. "Thank you for accommodating our schedule," she said, her tone suggesting that accommodation hadn't been optional. "I think it's important that the board understands the full scope of what we're discussing before decisions are made about Mr. Chen's future with this company." The legal documents she distributed painted a picture of systematic fraud that implicated not just Marcus, but potentially the entire corporate structure that had enabled his operations. Layla's presentation began with financial records that were damning in their precision. Each transaction traced through shell companies and offshore accounts with the kind of methodical documentation that left no room for alternative interpretation. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent months mastering every detail of Chen Industries' operations, her voice carrying echoes of her grandmother's diplomatic training as she explained how cultural consulting had been weaponized for profit. "These contracts were secured using my family's diplomatic relationships," she explained, letting that revelation settle over the room like a toxic cloud. Ambassador al-Rashid negotiated the original framework agreements in good faith, trusting that American companies would honor both the letter and spirit of cultural partnership. The betrayal of that trust wasn't just financial. It was personal, familial, and impossible to dismiss as mere business practice. The recorded conversations from Marcus's phone calls played through speakers that amplified every casual joke about diversity theater and cultural window dressing, each laugh a nail in the coffin of his professional reputation. Board members shifted uncomfortably as they listened to their CEO mock the very partnerships that had generated millions in revenue. His contempt for cultural sensitivity exposed in language that would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. The contrast between Chen Industries' public commitments to international cooperation and Marcus's private mockery was so stark it suggested systematic deception at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Several board members took notes with the urgency of people calculating their own liability in whatever legal storm was approaching. "The employment discrimination pattern is equally clear," Catherine continued, her voice cutting through the room's stunned silence like a surgical blade. 6 former employees with Middle Eastern backgrounds, all terminated within months of securing major contracts, all bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their experiences. She gestured toward documentation that showed Marcus's systematic exploitation of cultural expertise, his practice of hiring consultants for legitimacy, then discarding them once their usefulness expired. The pattern was so consistent, it couldn't be coincidence. So deliberate it suggested policy rather than prejudice. The legal implications were staggering. Not just individual discrimination claims, but potential conspiracy charges that could expose the entire company to criminal prosecution. The moment when the board realized they were facing an existential threat to the company's survival arrived with almost audible force, like air being sucked from the room. Emergency phone calls to corporate attorneys, whispered conferences about damage control strategies, and the kind of panic that only came from watching carefully constructed careers threatened by someone else's arrogance. Marcus sat at the head of the table looking increasingly isolated as his colleagues distanced themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing leaders who'd become liabilities. The man who dismissed Layla as just some refugee now watched his professional world collapse because he'd underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. "The Justice Department has expressed significant interest in this case," Catherine announced, her words carrying weight that went beyond individual consequences. "They see it as a template for addressing systematic exploitation in international business consulting. Your cooperation could influence how they proceed." The offer was presented with diplomatic precision, suggesting consequences that ranged from manageable settlement to criminal prosecution depending on how the company chose to respond. The board members exchanged glances that spoke of calculations being made in real time, weighing the cost of defending Marcus against the price of cutting him loose to save the company. The vote to terminate Marcus's employment was unanimous, delivered with the cold efficiency of corporate survival instincts overriding personal loyalty. His severance package evaporated under the weight of legal liability. His golden parachute transformed into a lead balloon by documentation of systematic fraud that stretched back years. As security escorted him from the building he'd controlled for a decade, Layla felt the satisfaction of watching justice delivered through the same corporate mechanisms that had enabled his crimes. The poetry book in her briefcase seemed to pulse with significance as Marcus disappeared into the elevator, his downfall complete and his victims finally vindicated by evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. The new board leadership that emerged from the crisis understood that their company's survival depended on genuine reform rather than cosmetic changes. Policies were implemented to protect whistleblowers, cultural consultants were given permanent positions with real authority, and the international partnerships that Marcus had exploited were restructured to ensure actual cooperation rather than extractive exploitation. Layla accepted a position as special advisor on cultural relations, her grandmother's diplomatic legacy finally finding the institutional home it deserved. The boardroom that had witnessed Marcus's downfall would become the place where real change began, where the promise of international cooperation could finally be honored rather than perverted for profit. 6 months later, the Meridian restaurant hummed with the same energy that had always characterized Manhattan's financial district during lunch hour. But something fundamental had shifted in the quality of conversations happening at those mahogany tables. Layla al-Rashid entered as a customer this time, her presence commanding the kind of respect that came from being recognized as someone who'd changed how an entire industry operated. The staff who greeted her did so with genuine warmth rather than professional obligation, their smiles reflecting the knowledge that she'd fought for their dignity when it mattered most. David Miller approached her table with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was still processing how dramatically his understanding of power dynamics had changed over the past year. "Ms. al-Rashid," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and residual amazement that the woman he'd almost fired had become one of the most influential voices in corporate reform. "It's an honor to have you back. I hope you know how much your actions have meant to our entire staff." The sentiment was genuine, reflecting changes that went beyond policy to encompass the daily reality of how employees were treated when customers became difficult. Training programs had been implemented, management protocols had been revised, and the kind of casual discrimination that had once been dismissed as customer service challenges was now recognized as unacceptable under any circumstances. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and it started with one woman's refusal to accept that dignity was negotiable. The view from her corner table encompassed both the bustling street outside and the internal dynamics of a restaurant that had become a symbol of change throughout the hospitality industry. New York's dining establishments had watched the Chen Industries case unfold, with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters, recognizing that the legal precedents being set would affect how they handled customer complaints and employee relations for years to come. The systematic documentation of retaliation that had brought Marcus down had exposed vulnerabilities that no business owner could afford to ignore. Insurance companies now required cultural sensitivity training. Employment lawyers specialized in hospitality discrimination. And the phrase, "customer is always right," had been quietly retired in favor of more nuanced approaches to conflict resolution. Her lunch companion arrived precisely on time, a young woman named Samira who'd reached out through the advocacy network that had grown around Layla's case. She was a recent graduate student facing discrimination at her internship with a consulting firm that specialized in international development projects, her story echoing themes that had become depressingly familiar over the past months. "They hired me specifically for my language skills and cultural background," Samira explained, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who discovered that her expertise was valued only when convenient. "But when I point out cultural insensitivity in their proposals, suddenly I'm being difficult and not a team player." The pattern was so consistent it might have been scripted, but now there were legal precedents and advocacy networks to address it systematically rather than individually. The conversation that followed felt like a masterclass in strategic thinking, Layla sharing lessons learned from her months of investigation and legal action. "Documentation is everything," she emphasized, explaining how systematic record-keeping had transformed her case from personal complaint to federal investigation. "But more than that, you need to understand that these fights aren't just about individual dignity. They're about changing systems that have been operating in plain sight for decades. The poetry book that had guided her through the darkest moments of her investigation now sat in a place of honor in her office, its pages offering wisdom to a new generation of advocates who understood that patience and strategy were more powerful than anger and confrontation. The changes at Chen Industries had rippled through the international business consulting world like a stone dropped in still water, each concentric circle representing new policies, legal precedents, and cultural shifts that went far beyond any individual company. Marcus Chen himself had disappeared from public view, his professional reputation destroyed and his personal finances devastated by legal settlements that would take years to resolve. The systematic exploitation he'd represented was being dismantled piece by piece through investigations that had grown from Layla's initial evidence into a comprehensive examination of how cultural partnerships had been perverted for profit. The justice wasn't just personal, it was institutional, creating safeguards that would protect future generations of immigrants and first-generation Americans from similar exploitation. As their lunch concluded and Samira prepared to implement the strategic advice she'd received, Layla felt the satisfaction of seeing her grandmother's legacy extending into the next generation. Ambassador al-Rashid's vision of cultural cooperation was finally being honored rather than exploited. Her diplomatic wisdom transformed into practical tools for achieving justice in corporate America. The poetry that had sustained 3 generations of al-Rashid women continued to offer guidance, its verses about patience and perseverance proving as relevant in Manhattan boardrooms as they had been in embassy conference rooms. The fight wasn't over, would probably never be entirely over, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that made future victories more possible. The final image that stayed with Layla as she walked through Midtown was of young professionals like Samira understanding that they didn't have to accept discrimination as the price of success, that there were networks of support and legal precedents that could protect their dignity while advancing their careers. The poetry book in her briefcase contained verses about justice that transcended individual circumstances, wisdom that applied to struggles that hadn't yet begun, and victories that hadn't yet been won. Marcus Chen had thought he was humiliating a powerless waitress, but he'd actually awakened something far more dangerous. A woman who understood both how power operated and how it could be challenged by those patient enough to plan, strategic enough to document, and connected enough to transform personal injury into systematic change. Standing in the afternoon sunlight streaming between Manhattan's glass towers, surrounded by the energy of a city that was slowly learning to do better, Layla felt her grandmother's presence in the wisdom that had guided her through months of careful preparation and strategic revelation. The real victory wasn't just Marcus's downfall. It was the knowledge that future generations would inherit a world where cultural dignity wasn't negotiable, where expertise was respected regardless of accent or background, and where the promise of international cooperation could finally be honored rather than exploited. The story was ending, but the work continued, carried forward by voices that refused to be silenced and supported by networks that had learned how to fight smart rather than just fighting hard. The end. If you're reading this during your coffee break or lunch hour, drop a comment about where you're tuning in from, whether it's a bustling office in downtown Chicago, a quiet cafe in Portland, or anywhere in between. Stories like Layla's remind us that justice can come from the most unexpected places, and that underestimating someone because of assumptions about their background is not just morally wrong, it can be strategically devastating. Remember, dignity isn't negotiable. Expertise deserves respect regardless of accent, and sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is patience combined with perfect documentation. The Marcus Chens of the world count on our silence, but they've never planned for our strategic thinking.